Tenemos un invitado muy especial que nos acompaña desde Londres, Geoff Mulgan, profesor de University College London, quien se va a referir a lo abordado en su libro Potencial de la inteligencia colectiva de transformar las escuelas, un texto que proporciona un análisis sofisticado de las diversas formas humanas y computacionales de la inteligencia colectiva.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to share with you some ideas about education and schools which come from a career where I've worked sometimes within governments, shaping school policy, sometimes from the bottom up, creating new kinds of school, for example, as a funder in my last job at Nesta, funding new models of education, the uses of technology. And currently, a lot of my work is about collective intelligence. And what I'm going to share is some thoughts about what this might mean for schools, how this could become part of the common sense of the next 5, 10, or 20 years. I'm going to talk about what collective intelligence is, some of the things we've learned about learning through the lockdowns of COVID-19, and then some ideas which I hope might be of interest to you, which school systems could borrow from other fields, which have been pioneering new ways of tapping into the brain power of people, of citizens, of professionals, and others. And I hope at the very least this will stimulate some thought. So first, a little bit of history. Some of the ideas of collective intelligence go back a little bit over 100 years, when a very famous experiment took place in a country fair, where a scientist, Francis Galton, observed lots of people guessing the weight of a cow. And famously, the average of 800 guesses was almost exactly accurate, though each individual guess was inaccurate. And out of this came this notion of the wisdom of crowds, that if you can organize crowds or large groups of people to think in the right way, they may be smarter than even the smartest person in the room. Now, it turned out even when this was happening, there was something done before it, which is also, I think, relevant to education. In the 1860s, an attempt was made to create a comprehensive dictionary of the English language to map every meaning of every word. And this was clearly much too big a task for any one individual to do. So instead, thousands of volunteers were mobilized to map meanings back in medieval times, in the 18th century, and gather together in a very structured way the history of meanings of every word in the English language. This turned out to be the Oxford English Dictionary. And almost every method later used by Wikipedia was actually prefigured in the 1860s and 70s in this mass exercise of collective intelligence, of mobilizing thousands of people to map a language and its meanings, because no individual could do it. Now, these models are now all around us. Wikipedia is one of the most famous. This is using the world's brain power, millions of people, to map all of our knowledge. There are many examples in science, like Zooniverse, which again has millions of people mapping stars in the sky, counting the number of penguins in the Antarctic, mapping nature in all sorts of ways, the whole movement of what's called citizen science. And then there are projects like Waze, which is now part of Google, which uses input from drivers to map mobility in a city. So combining the data and the sensors that Google has with human-generated intelligence in order to make the system smarter. There are many, many examples of these kinds, all now trying to mobilize brain power on a large scale using internet technologies. Now, some of these have been pioneered by organizations like NASA, and this is one of their interesting experiments, which maybe a school might copy. They hid some red balloons randomly across the USA, and the challenge was to come up with a method of finding those hidden balloons in a matter of hours. And lots of teams competed, and the challenge for them was, how do you motivate and mobilize strangers all over the country to help you find a hidden object? And this was a collective intelligence challenge, which the winning team had quite a clever method of using cash incentives And always when these experiments were done, all the balloons were found within a matter of hours. So it turns out that with a bit of smart design, you can mobilize the intelligence of huge numbers of strangers you've never met before. There are also examples in healthcare. This is one from a woman who pioneered methods of creating an artificial pancreas with hundreds of patients who were frustrated with the medical establishment, pooled their ideas and their data to create their own artificial pancreas. And in the health system, there are now lots of examples of these patient-generated projects, patients often funding R&D themselves, sharing data, designing new solutions to their problems. Now, I wrote about some of these a few years ago in a book called Big Mind, which tried to document how collective intelligence could be used in different fields, from democracy to universities to businesses. And since then, I've been trying to apply these ideas in practice to different fields. And the basic argument was that any group, any organization, any system like a school system or a society, in order to think well, it needs some of the things we do all the time in our own individual brains. We combine every minute of the day, observations and data, what we see, what we hear. We have models of how we expect the world to work. We have our own ways of predicting what will happen if I lift up this glass or put it down. We have our memory, we have our coordination, we have empathy, creativity, judgment, and wisdom. And I argue exactly the same applies within an individual school or a school system. And this can either be organized casually or randomly or badly, or it can all be organized well, effectively, and consciously. And indeed, you can look at any organization and ask, how well does it observe? Does it look at the right things? Does it have the right models of how the world works? Does it organize its memory well? Does it empathize with human experience? And so on. The one other bit of theory I argued was that in any system, we learn in different kinds of loops. Some loops, the first loop learning, are where you have an existing model and some new data comes in and you slightly adjust. A second loop learning may be where you need an entirely new category to think with. And third loop learning is where you have to rethink how you think altogether. And I show this in relation to education, where first loop learning might be experiments in maths teaching, which show some need to change the models a little bit. Or second loop learning may be opening up to recognize that non-cognitive skills and ways of thinking may be as important as the formal cognitive ones. And then all our systems are trying to learn how to use AI tools for assessment, but without bias. And this has been a very controversial issue, but it's a kind of third loop learning which all school systems are going through now. Now, the core to my argument is that for any system really to be smart, it needs to combine all these things together in what I call an intelligence assembly. For a school system to be as clever as your brains, it needs to link its observations, its models, its interpretations, its memory, and its creativity, and loop them into action and learning with the different loops I described in a coherent way, in an integrated way, in a way that anyone who's within an individual school can easily access the intelligence of the whole system, can find out what's happening, what's being learned, what's working, what are the new ideas, what are the new concepts which might be relevant to the practice of teaching. Now, one part of this is memory, and I just want to briefly touch on this because this is quite a large part of my work now. How does a school system learn from the past? Know what has been done, what's been tried, and what happened. A few years ago in the UK, we set up a thing called the Education Endowment Foundation, which tried to synthesize evidence for teachers. And it looked at lots of different things you could do in classrooms for 5 to 16-year-olds to show how much they cost, what the strength of evidence behind them was. And then on the right-hand column, what impact they had on a child's advancement in terms of the equivalent of months of schooling. And that's been quite a successful way of simplifying, summarizing huge amounts of evidence in a way that busy teachers, busy head teachers can access and make sense of. And I know there are Spanish language equivalents of this now across South America. And this is really about distilling collective intelligence of a system in an easily accessible form. More recently, I've been helping to run a thing called IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory, on COVID, where we gather together evidence from around the world to make it accessible to, again, teachers or policymakers. And we've done a lot of work on, for example, the impact of school closures on children, what's been learned about online learning, what's been learned about the mental health of children through the pandemic, in order to help the system be collectively more intelligent in its responses to the trials and challenges of the pandemic. And so here is just an example, which is where we try to synthesize what had been learned globally about remote education in secondary schools through the pandemic. This is all freely available online if you want to see in more detail. We tried to look at what had happened where all over the world, very, very suddenly, schools had to shift from face-to-face learning to online. We looked at lots of meta-studies and studies, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on the criteria, the process of looking at text and data and quality appraisal, which is probably only of interest to the nerds. But as you can see, there's thousands of studies to draw on. There's a lot of research happens into schooling now. And then we tried to be as global as possible, though not very much, I'm afraid, from South America. This is mainly biased towards Asia, Europe, and North America. But I think some of the patterns are probably fairly common in many parts of the world. And we tried to get feedback from, or studies which looked at what had happened for students, teachers, parents, and school leaders. So not just looking at the school level profile. And those are some of the years of the responses. And crucially, to look at all these different kind of technology tools, synchronous collaboration tools, knowledge organization tools, text-based tools, multimodal production tools, assessment tools, and social networking tools, all of which became far more important during the pandemic. And the theory, in a sense, was that we had to look at a series of nested systems, the microsystem within the school, but also how that fitted into a larger systems of institutions and regulation and family behavior and the overall society. So trying to avoid, I guess, the mistake of believing each school is an entirely separate institution. And what this showed was a series of patterns on both engagement and disengagement. This is just one example. So looking first of all at flipped learning before the pandemic, both the increased engagement patterns, where students were getting more interaction with their peers, enjoyment, participation, and so on, but also a significant minority before the pandemic weren't benefiting so much. In a way, we've seen the same through the pandemic, some students benefiting from heightened self-regulation, better understanding of topics and tasks, actually enjoying the online education more, but a large minority too feeling more isolated socially, perhaps that's not surprising, missing live lessons, feeling more confused, more overwhelmed, and not liking it. So out of this picture, we get quite a subtle, complex account of the collective experience of the world's school systems through a very remarkable and very challenging time. And that's a summary of both some of the positives and the negatives that students experienced. Now, that's a little bit about collective intelligence and evidence. I want to briefly just share a few examples from other fields that I think could be relevant to school systems becoming collectively intelligent in the future. So one on which there's already a lot happening is the use of experiments. Formal experiments, sometimes randomized control trials, try something out in one school, use another class as a control group. And this does help to clarify what works and what doesn't. And we look at all the different kind of experimental approaches which can be used in school systems. Not all have to be full randomized controlled trials. There's many different methods of organizing experiments and non-randomized ones. And in my last job at Nesta, we tried to create simple online tools teachers could use to run their own experiments and analyze the data very easily without having to use the full weight of a university or the expense of formal experiments. And you can find all of this on the Nesta website. But the idea was to make experimentation part of what it means to be a good teacher, that you're always trying things out, seeing what could work better. There's then interesting examples where a community of practice becomes a collective intelligence. This is a very different field to education. It's farmers in East Africa who, through the We Farm organization, that allows any farmer to share a problem they're dealing with. Then We Farm, using AI, finds another member of the community who can answer the problem, and then it sends it as a text message back to the first farmer. There's nearly 2 million farmers now on this system. It's incredibly simple. I don't think any school system in the world has yet done quite an equivalent, but it's kind of an obvious thing you might expect. If a maths teacher is facing a particular problem of curriculum or assessment, why can't they see if someone else amongst the millions of teachers worldwide has already answered that problem and can quickly provide them a solution? A lot of innovation uses these collective intelligence methods. I've already mentioned NASA once. NASA used to try and answer problems internally with its scientists in Houston. Now they open up many of their problems to anyone, anywhere to help them solve. So it could be designing new software for rockets or new spacesuits. They allow anyone to offer solutions. And this way of organizing innovation as a collective intelligence process, I think, will become increasingly common. And sometimes really good innovations for schools may come from outside the school world, may come from very different fields. And we need new methods of tapping into that much wider collective intelligence. So not just of teachers or parents or pupils or bureaucrats, but also perhaps from neighboring fields, like even farming may have some ideas to offer. Lego is an interesting example of that. They mobilize their consumers as a source of collective intelligence. So thousands of users of Lego were mobilized over the last 10 years to design new ideas, new uses. And this is now kind of mainstream for Lego, that crowdsourcing, co-creation with fans is often a better way to come up with ideas than doing it all internally. Now, a lot of these ideas may be very familiar to some of you, may be a bit more novel. I think they're going to become part of the conventional wisdom of the 2020s. And for one sign of that, there's an interesting project led by the United Nations and the UNDP called the Accelerator Labs. There are, I think, 92 of them now in operation around the world in, I think, 100 countries. And they're using these sort of intelligence methods to speed up innovation around the Sustainable Development Goals. How do you use data? How do you use citizen insights? How do you use lived experience as well as formal evidence to speed up solving problems like access to water, or gender equity, or better education? And a few months ago, the report you'll see there on the screen, Collective Intelligence for Sustainable Development, was published by the UN with Nesta, with lots of examples of what that means in practice, combining human intelligence and artificial intelligence, grassroots insight with formal evidence, in order to speed up problem solving. And if you get a chance to look at that report, I think you will also get a flavor of what might be normal in school systems in 5 or 10 years' time, where there is this systematic organization hungry organization of knowledge of all kinds to speed up improvement. So what I hope we will see increasingly in the future is this systematic commitment to collective intelligence in education, orchestrating the evidence, what has been learned, what's been found out, whether it's through pandemics or the practicalities of perhaps helping kids suffering from mental health problems in school. Much more mobilization of everyone to take part in experiments and learning and trying things out, and often shared data to underpin that, data with suitable anonymization to stop abuses. Our problem in many countries, though, is it's not quite clear whose job it is to do that, to do the orchestration and curation. And this, I think, is the great challenge of the 2020s, is we need, as it were, system owners who can take on that task and help all of us to be a little bit like these little fish who coordinate very well in protecting themselves from the bigger fish. They turn themselves into something more like a shared brain. And that is, to my mind, our collective challenge of the near future, how we can collectively become more intelligent too. I hope that gives you some food for thought, and good luck with the rest of the event.
Interesante la reflexión sobre la inteligencia colectiva y la idea de que como sociedad podemos lograr muchas cosas siempre y cuando trabajemos en conjunto.